Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Happy New Year.
Thank
It's
you.
the last day I'm going to tell people Happy New Year because we're already 7 days into the new year, so we've completed a week. But happy holidays to you. We're going back a long, long time on this one, and there's a reason I'm going back a long, long time on this one. This is 1927. And there's nobody in this room who remembers 1927. But there is a reason I'm doing it, because this is the year of modern America. This is when modern America really starts. And a lot of the things that you have had and I have had in my lifetime, you can trace back to this year. Like flying, Charles Lindbergh, talking movies. You have Al Jolson and the jazz singer. Babe Ruth hits 60 home runs. The long count fight with Jack Tunney and Jack Dempsey, and that's another thing. It's celebrity. Celebrities were big in the 1920s, particularly in 1927, like Clara Bow, the It Girl. And how many of you heard over the years, she's the It Girl? Well, the It Girl. Also, Calvin Coolidge and the perceived perception that during the 1920s, the economy was red hot, and it was for certain people. Also the flappers. I don't know if any of your parents were flappers, or older siblings might have been flappers, but flappers were women who did not want to be traditional women in the sense that their mothers were or their grandmothers were in the 1870s or the 1890s. The Model A Ford was released in 1927. The Nazis are just a fringe party that very few people are paying attention to in Germany in 1927, and Joseph Stalin becomes the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. Mount Rushmore. I don't know how, I've never been to Mount Rushmore. Anybody in here, you've been there? This is what it looked like when it started. Just a mountain. And it started in 1927. There was the Great Mississippi Flood. No real lessons were learned from that in 1927 when it came to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Columbia Broadcasting System, radio, the second radio network that started in the United States and the one that I work for. Also, how many of you remember Old Man River? Well, came from this show, Showboat. Oscar Hammerstein working with Jerome Kern on this one. Although if you go to the Rogers and Hammerstein site, they talk about Hammerstein in Old Man River. And how many of you like Laurel and Hardy? Yeah. Yep, well, Laurel and Hardy are put together for the first time, really for the first time in 1927. And organized crime and prohibition. And speakeasies, and there's an unfortunate guy who was a victim of organized crime. The first solo transatlantic flight. America enters the modern age. The one that we live in today can be traced back to 1927. The first solo transatlantic flight. The release of the first talking picture. The invention of the jukebox. How many of you went to a diner, put a nickel in the jukebox, and never heard your song? Because it was 14 songs away. But the jukebox. Handful of milestones that came about 1927. And it was probably the peak of the Roaring 20s, a span of time which dozens of significant events took place in America and around the world. The economy was booming. The Jazz Age, full swing. George Gershwin is a major star on Broadway. Social mores, looser than ever. And the nation is celebrating new dances, the Charleston, gadgets, heroes. In sports, records were broken, and several champions in different fields thrilled fans with outstanding feats. But this guy stood out, Charles Lindbergh, before we knew who Charles Lindbergh really was. But Charles Lindbergh was a daredevil. He was flying, delivering mail, and there was a contest. The first person who went from New York to Paris would get a big, big payoff. Other people tried it, they didn't do it. In May 1915, the French-born American businessman Raymond Ortage announced as a stimulus to the courageous aviators, "I desire to offer a prize of $25,000 to the first aviator of any allied country," which would be Italy, Britain, America, England, because this is after World War I, crossing the Atlantic in one flight from Paris to New York or New York to Paris. All the other details in your care. I'll give you the 25 grand, but you got to invest in it. You got to invest money and your time, and you know what? If you do it, here's the $25,000, which would probably be something today like $500,000, maybe a bit more. On September 15, 1926, the French flyer René Fonck and his crew attempted to take off from Roosevelt Field in New York. That's where the Nassau Coliseum is today, and also Roosevelt Field out in Long Island. Nearby is the shopping center, only to crash at the end of the runway, killing 2 of the 4 crew members. Upon reading about Fonck's failures, Lindbergh began to plan his own flight to Paris, figuring that a non-stop flight between New York and Paris would be less hazardous than flying mail for a single winter. He didn't want to fly around in the winter delivering mail, so let's go to Paris instead and see if we can get the $25,000. Well, a former barnstormer and an airmail pilot, he's 25 years old, he's no rookie aviator. And he discusses this idea with St. Louis businessmen and aviation supporters. He gets $15,000 from Harold Bixby, the head of the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce, sets his sight on the $25,000 prize. All he needed now was the plane. He's got everything else figured out, but he has no plane. And there is Charles Lindbergh. He decided to work with Ryan Aeronautical Company in San Diego, California. Ryan quoted Lindbergh and his backers $10,580, the price to build a single-engine monoplane powered by a Wright Whirlwind J5 engine in 6 days. Lindbergh wanted to make the flight by himself because he did not want to overload the airplane with other people. That is the airplane, and it hangs at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. with a whole bunch of other airplanes right near it. But that's the airplane that they designed for him. On April 25th, the plane was completed and testing began. 15 days later, the Spirit of St. Louis was declared ready to make the transatlantic flight. Lindbergh left California on the afternoon of May 10th, planning to fly through the night to St. Louis. He completed the 1,500-mile trip in 14 hours and 25 minutes. That's a new record, or a record at that time, for a nonstop flight of that distance. Lucky Lindy, here he is on Long Island. He's ready to go. New York to Paris flight, Captain Charles Lindbergh, Ryan monoplane, Red Crown Aviation gasoline, also Mobil oil. They're all set to go. After spending a day with his supporters in St. Louis, he continued his way to New York. He feared if he lingered, someone else would beat him in the race for the $25,000. Lindbergh's flight from St. Louis to New York took 7 hours, 22 minutes. So combined, he flies the country in less than 22 hours, which is a new world's record. And there he is. That is Uniondale, New York, a place that I'm very familiar with. And he's about ready to go on the trip of a lifetime. On May 20th, Lindbergh took flight aboard the Spirit of St. Louis, a highly modified Ryan M2 aircraft, in an attempt to become the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic. Lucky Lindy charted a course from New York to Paris despite ice, fog, and sleep deprivation. He achieved what many had failed before him. On the evening, May 21st, Lindbergh, in the Spirit of St. Louis, touched down at the Le Bourget airfield in Paris. He went 3,610 miles in 33 and a half hours. And there they are. They're out to greet him. He is there, and he is now a conquering hero. The excited crowd carried Lindbergh on his shoulders. or their shoulders, before a quick-thinking Frenchman placed Lindbergh's flight helmet on the nearby reporter, creating a distraction that allowed Lindbergh to escape to a nearby hangar, where he was met by the American ambassador to France, Myron T. Herrick. He's a celebrity. He is a big-time celebrity. He did something nobody else did. And he replaced Gertrude Ederle, who was America's Girl, who swam the English Channel in 1926 as an American hero. And he gets the largest ticker tape parade down Broadway ever. New York recognized Lindbergh's groundbreaking achievement with a jubilant celebration upon his return to the United States. The massive reception for pioneering aviator Charles Lindbergh attracted millions of spectators to Lower Manhattan and made the ticker tape parade famous around the world. Well, others got ticker tape parade, but Charles Lindbergh got the biggest ticker tape parade, and it's a tradition that carries on nearly a century later. Meanwhile, the jazz singer. How many of you saw the original jazz singer somewhere along the line? Yeah, there's really not much dialogue in there. And there were other movies that had some dialogue in there before, but this is the most famous of the start of the talkies. It wasn't the first talking picture, or even the 1000th, but the jazz singer leveraged the convergence of technology, studio ambition, and an electronic personality, Al Jolson. You ain't seen nothing yet. The world's greatest entertainer, to become the first successful synchronized feature with talking. Sam Warner and the Warner Brothers back in those days lived about 4 miles from here on California Road in Mount Vernon. That's where they were. Sam Warner was wowed by Bell Laboratories' demonstration of a new sound film system in 1925 and decided to experiment. This is what they came up with, a 1926 talkie, Don Juan, starring John Barrymore. That was released by Warner Brothers. It was the first feature-length film to utilize the Vitaphone sound-on-disc sound system with synchronized music score and sound effects. It has no spoken dialogue. What the studios found out was this: audiences wanted synchronized talking and singing rather than silent pictures with music and sound effects. Well, George Jessel was supposed to be the first guy, or he was the first choice of Warner Brothers to be in the jazz singer. And he looks like he just stepped out of synagogue on Saturday, doesn't he? George Jessel, but there he is, Georgie Jessel. I don't recognize him without all those medals. Remember he used to have all those medals on his chest, the Toastmaster General of the United States? The studio released more silent films with Vitaphone accompaniment over the next year. But in a year, the studio announced that the contract star George Jessel would appear in an adaptation of his Broadway hit, The Jazz Singer. That changed. Warner Brothers decided that the jazz singer needed Al Jolson to assure attention and success, not only for the film, but for also its new sound system, Vitaphone. And there he is, Al Jolson. And Al Jolson gets a bad rep because of blackface. He wasn't the only one who was in blackface in those days. In fact, I'm sure you've heard of Sophie Tucker, right? Sophie Tucker started her career as a singer in blackface. It was a rather common form of entertainment, minstrel show. But there's Jolie. The world's greatest entertainer in the 1920s, he stars as a man who turns his back on family tradition of being a cantor in synagogue to follow his heart and to go into showbiz against his father's wishes. The semi-autobiography film of Jolson's life was based on Samson Raphael's 1922 story, The Day of the Atonement, and his 1925 Broadway play, The Jazz Singer. Anybody ever hear of Warner Wolf here, the sportscaster? Well, I know Warner Wolf. He's on Channel 2 and Channel 7 in New York. He was born in 1938, and he told me that his Moyle, the guy who did the religious circumcision, was Al Jolson's father. I said, he had to be about 80 years old by that point. So anyway, that's my brush with Jolson. The Jazz Singer. there it is, at the Warner's Theater. Al Jolson, the jazz singer, twice daily. They put in a lot of time and effort on this movie. It premiered on October 6th in 2 theaters. It was, in fact, largely silent, with music and sound effects covering those portions. There were just 2 minutes of dialogue, but it was the first feature film to incorporate 2 synchronized dialogue sequences. It was the spoken language that made the jazz singer a sensation and began the death knell for silent films. The words were uttered in a short scene in the movie. And Jolson utters a few unscripted words to the orchestra leader reciting a line that went down in history. Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. It was the spoken dialogue that made the jazz singer a sensation and kills the silent movies. The critics were less than impressed, and the reviews were mixed, with many commenting on Jolson's hammy performance. In 1934, Jolson did a movie where he refers to himself as a ham. And the New York Herald Tribune calling it a pleasant enough sentimental orgy. The Talkies, it's a Warner Brothers production. The transition to sound driven by the jazz singer's success drove Warner Brothers' expansion, purchases of hundreds of theaters and First National Studios, and its stock price went from $21 to $132 a share in 1928. Warner Brothers announced that all future features would be offered with the synchronized Vitaphone accompaniment. That's the Babe. You know, here we are in 2024, and when people talk about the greatest baseball player of all time, they start at number 2, because he was still, and he hasn't played since in 89 years, Babe Ruth is still considered the greatest player of all time. He won 88 games as a pitcher, and he hit 714 home runs. But his greatest season came in 1927. On September 30th, Babe Ruth hit his 60th home run of the season, and with it sets a new one-season home run record. For more than 5 years, ever since he hit a Major League record 59 home runs in 1921, he'd been trying to surpass that mark. The closest he came, 47 in 1926. The beginning of the 1927 season, he's 32 years old, which means he doesn't have much more to play. Ruth's record looked out of reach. Babe was also in the movies. He was so big. Him, Jack Dempsey, Rudolph Valentino, Al Jolson, they were all bigger than life celebrities in the 1920s. This one is a silent film from First National Pictures called Babe Comes Home, and no prints exist of this. This is basically all that exists. Ruth led the American League in home runs throughout the year, but did not appear to be in reach of his record 59 home runs set in 1921, but he hit 16 in the month of September. He tied the record on September 30th, 29th rather, on September 30th, the last game of the season. He came to the plate against lefty Tom Zachary of the Washington Senators in the 8th inning. With the count at 2-1, Ruth launched the Zachary pitch high into the right field bleachers. That Yankee team is considered one of the greatest teams of all time. They had a number of Hall of Famers, and their manager was Miller Huggins, who's also in the Hall of Fame. They were a great team. They won 110 games. They lost 44, swept the Pittsburgh Pirates baseball team 4-0 in the World Series. They had 6 Hall of Fame players, Hall of Fame manager. They hit 158 home runs, outscored opponents by 376 runs, won the pennant by 19 games, the most to that point in American League history. Ruth, Lou Gehrig, by the way, Lou Gehrig's house is up for sale about 4 miles or 5 miles from here over in New Rochelle. You can buy it right now. Lou Gehrig, Tony Lazzari, Earl Combs, Wade Hoyt, and Herb Pennock. Wade Hoyt and Herb Pennock were Hall of Fame players. The manager, Miller Huggins, was the Hall of Fame manager. Also, another big sports event. Jack Dempsey, another guy, bigger than life in 1927, the long count fight. And it's a 10-round rematch between the world heavyweight champion Gene Tunney and the former champion Jack Dempsey. Tunney beat Dempsey on September 23rd, 1926. It's Soldier Field, Chicago. 105,000 people go to the boxing match. 105,000 people. Tunney's knocked down in the 7th round, but the count was delayed due to Dempsey's failure to go and remain in the neutral corner. Whether this long count actually affected the outcome remains a subject of debate nearly a century later. The rematch, people made paintings of it, the rematch between Tunney and Dempsey. There was a new rule, said a fighter who scores a knockdown has to go instantly to a neutral corner in place, and that was forgotten by Dempsey, and Tunney was given precious seconds as a challenger hovered over him. It was later estimated that Tunney was down for 13 or 14 seconds. He got up at 9 seconds, the long count. Tunney was down for about 3 to 8 seconds. The referee, Dave Barry, could not start the count on Tunney until Dempsey reached the neutral corner, but he was still able to count to 9 before Tunney got up. Tunney would win a 10-round decision, and Dempsey, a 1920s global icon, retired. The It Girl. How many of you heard the expression, the It Girl? You've heard it. Everybody in here has heard it. Somewhere in your life, you've heard, hey, that's the It Girl. Well, that is the It Girl, Clara Bow.
Who is it? What's her name?
Clara Bow. Clara Bow. You don't remember Clara Bow? How many of you remember Clara Bow? You do. She was a megastar. She was bigger than Marilyn Monroe in her time. She was, and Marilyn Monroe was huge. She was the star. The movie, The It Girl, is about a working class shop girl named Betty Lou Spence, played by Clara Bow, who develops a crush on the new manager of the Waltham department store, Cyrus Waltham, played by Antonio Marino. Two people from different classes of life trying to develop common ground for a relationship. It's a boy or girl falls in love with a girl or boy movie. Simple. The personal quality, it, provides the magic to make it happen. The film gave Bow her nickname, the It Girls. The movie solidified Clara Bow's importance as a sex symbol in a culture that had been growing in interest in expanding morale revolution thanks to jazz music, partying teenagers, and flappers. The It Girl. She doesn't leave much to the imagination, does she? Here's the boss. Yeah, and here's the boss, and she's on his desk, right? And she's all, looks like she's ready for action, right? The culture was transforming. Money was flowing, and women were finally celebrating their sexuality after years of repression. The modern woman of the 1920s was unapologetic about dressing up, dancing, and having a good time, just like their male counterparts. The writer, Eleanor Glynn, described it as warmth, charisma, vivacity, and apparently effortless charm. But that was the city. In rural America, like Hermosa, South Dakota, it was a different life entirely. In the 1920s, Americans faced a perplexing world. While many Americans still believed in the Victorian values of modesty, hard work, and respect for tradition, status, and place, others defiantly broke from convention in their work and personal lives, in their action and words. Most Americans searched for a compromise between the world they knew and the world that they would come to know, not yet really ready to really disengage from the past or to fully embrace the future. There was an urban versus rural split. You know what? In 2024, that paragraph still resonates. The popular image of the 1920s is that of a decade of prosperity and riotous living, and of bootleggers and gangsters, and flappers, and hot jazz, and flagpole sitters, and marathon dancers, and that's etched in the American psyche. But the truth was, it was a
decade of deep cultural conflict, pitting the more cosmopolitan, modernist, urban culture against the more provincial, traditionalist, rural culture. The Roaring Twenties, health authorities terminate dance marathon at local ballrooms. They're dancing too much. They're dancing too much. That's the problem. On the surface, the economy was good during Calvin Coolidge's presidency, which started in August 1923 following the death of Warren G. Harding. But a closer look at the Coolidge prosperity suggests something else. During the years of the Coolidge prosperity, business corporations reaped unprecedented riches as profits soared by 62%, but wages only inched up by 7%. It was a period of immense prosperity for America, a certain part of America. And the engineer of the new, or the engine of the new prosperity was the automobile, which by then had become the largest industry in the country, led by General Motors and Ford Motor. In the Roaring Twenties, cars tripled in number. Manufacturing was consuming 20% of the steel, 80% of the rubber, 75% of the plate glass available. In the Dow Jones, if you played the stock market and had the money, or said you were going to, or bought on margin, and had to pay back that money eventually, went up 400%. But there were bank failures in the 1920s. A lot of bank failures. Coolidge's failure to aid the depressed agricultural sector seemed short-sighted. About 5,000 rural banks in the Midwest and the South shut their doors in bankruptcy, while many thousands of farmers lost their lands. His tax cuts contributed to an uneven distribution of wealth and overproduction of goods. Many Americans were deeply in debt for having purchased consumer goods on easy installment credit terms. You can get a credit card at Sears and Roebuck or a store like that if you're a man. If you're a woman, you got a credit card, but you had to have a man sign for you, whether it was your father, husband, brother, boyfriend, or another relative. Women could not get credit cards in their own name until 1974, when it became law. Well, this is a farmer during the Coolidge prosperity. Despite agricultural overproduction and successive attempts in Congress to provide relief, the agricultural economy of the 1920s experienced an ongoing depression. Large surpluses were accompanied by falling prices at a time when farmers were burdened by a heavy debt. The Coolidge prosperity was not good for everyone, only a select few. And there is Calvin Coolidge. It was the banker, Andrew Mellon, Coolidge's Secretary of Treasury and one of the world's richest men, who engineered successful tax reductions. The group that did not fare well during the Coolidge prosperity was primarily the lower and middle class American families. But a group that did well was liquor bootleggers. Coolidge personally opposed prohibition, but sought to enforce federal law and refrain from serving liquor in the White House. Speakeasies. Even Harpo Marx could get into a speakeasy. All you had to know was the password. And he knew the password there, swordfish. Speakeasies were the Prohibition's worst kept secret. When Prohibition took effect on January 17, 1920, many thousands of formerly legal saloons across the country catering to men only closed down. Women couldn't get into most saloons. People wanting to drink had to buy liquor from licensed druggists for medicinal purposes, clergymen for religious reasons, or illegal sellers known as bootleggers. Let me tell you about a bootlegger I knew when I was 18 years old. His name was Albert Morris. I was working at the Rockland Drive-In in Muncie, New York, and Al was born, say, 1899 or 1900. He was born in Canada. He fought in World War I. He operated a little airport in Rockland County. In fact, he operated two of them. And he lived in the hill section back in those days. And one day, I'm 18 years old, and I know I'm going into journalism. I'm writing a little bit, but I needed some money, and so I worked at drive-in movies. So one day, I'm talking to Al, said, Al, what was life like when you were 18 years old? He said, well, he was flying in World War I. Then he came home, and he was looking for an opportunity. And an opportunity arose when Prohibition started. Al told me that he was a bootlegger. Now, that's all he told me, really, about his profession. Other than he lived in Spring Valley, he went over to Suffren. Suffren was the railroad, and still is the railroad terminus from Montreal, and goes west to Chicago. And he would get up every morning, he would drive to Suffren, pick up the booze, bring it back to his house, water it down, put it back in his car, put it in the bathtub and watered it down, put the booze back into the barrel, put it in the car, and put it on a tray. I said, well, who'd you get it from? I don't know. Well, where was it going? I don't know. Well, the end of that line is Chicago. Was it going to Capone? Was it going to George Remus? I don't know. Well, who paid you? I don't know. I said, Al, it's 1974. You could come clean. He never did. I worked there in 74, 75, and 76. I tried to get an answer out of him for 3 years. I never got an answer out of him. He was still living by the code of silence. I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. An option was to enter private, unsolicited bar rooms named speakeasies for how low you had to speak the password to gain entry as to not be overheard by law enforcement. And that's a speakeasy. And you got entertained. This particular speakeasy is the Cotton Club in Harlem. Mobsters made millions of dollars every year from bootlegging and running thousands of speakeasies. Police officers and federal agents turned a blind eye to those who were more than happy to pay them off. People could meet to drink bootleg alcohol, gamble, watch dance girls, listen to jazz and other popular music at the time. Duke Ellington. This is where Duke Ellington became famous. He fronted the house band at Harlem's Cotton Clubs, and WHN Radio in New York broadcast from the Cotton Club. That's how Duke Ellington became well known. And there, looks like a regular bar, doesn't it? There you go. There was a struggle between old America and new America. Immigration, race, alcohol, evolution, gender politics, sexual morality, all became cultural battlefields. Sounds like today, doesn't it? 100 years later? Sounds just like today. Wets battled dries, religious modernists battled religious fundamentalists, and urban ethnics battled the Ku Klux Klan. Why would you sit on a flagpole? Why would you sit on, I never met a flagpole. I met plate spinners, but I've never met anybody who sat on a flagpole. That was the thing to do. The cultural war combatants had one thing in common. They wanted to make money. Throughout the 20s, the U.S. Economy expanded rapidly and the nation's wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 29, the Roaring '20s. Flappers! Flappers! Anybody, you must have known a flapper somewhere in your life. They became conservative housewives eventually. The flappers. While the United States' involvement in World War I started in 1917 and lasted till the war's end in 1918, during that time, while the boys were fighting in Europe, the women had to take their jobs. And they found out when the war ended on November 11th, 1918, they liked working. They liked having paychecks. They liked independence. They had developed a carefree attitude. And many women in 1920 got the right to vote, but not all women. There were restrictions on women who could vote. Native American, Asian American, Latinx, and African American women were excluded. The culture quickly shifted from women being expected to be wives who are subordinate to their husbands to women valuing independence and breaking the rules. Many young women, well, they became flappers. The 1890s was a distant memory for them, although their mothers could remind them of that era. The flappers, the lost girls, the symbolization of the flappers. Unlike their mothers and grandmothers, flappers tended to go to high school and even college, and they devoured new books featuring confident, fun-loving adolescent heroines who hiked and camped, solved mysteries. Flappers biked, played golf and tennis, strove to emulate the flat-chested and hipless physiques of adolescent boys whose freedom and lack of domestic responsibilities they envied. The Flappers were a grave source of worry to their parents, educators, physicians, clergymen who feared that sports and higher education would be ruinous and be terrible, absolutely terrible for these women. They're doing the Charleston. They're having a grand old time doing the Charleston. There's the flapper dress. They basically bound their breasts to make them as small as they could. And they had their hats, they had their haircuts. There they are. The post-war prosperity expressed itself in many ways. Credit available, department stores open as the middle class could now use credit to obtain upper-class luxuries, leading to the birth of consumerism. And with it came the flapper dress, mass-produced for public consumption. Oh, tell me if this is 1927 or 2024. New cosmetic companies sold skin cream to eradicate wrinkles. Magazine advertised flapper hairstyles and clothing, plus extreme diets and dubious claims for slimming effects of cigarettes and chewing gum. Some women decided, hey, let's have cosmetic surgery, facelifts, kicking off an era of damaging self-scrutiny, obsession with weight, youthfulness, and body image. And there's the hairstyle, the bob. Flapper cut her hair short into what was called the bob. She wore shorter dresses, rouged her knees. I can never figure that one out. Why would you rouge your knees unless you're telling a guy, hey, here I am, and her cheeks as well. She drank alcohol, smoked cigarettes, dated multiple men before she got married, and she was able to get access to birth control, such as the diaphragm, so she could experiment with sex before she got married. They went to speakeasies, where they drank alcohol provided by gangsters. Well, if you weren't a flapper and you were doing housewife chores, you welcomed this, the electric washing machine. It came in the 1920s. Advances in technology led to the age of electricity, and many homes in America, especially in the industrialized cities, were powered by electricity. Access to electricity in the 1920s provided Americans with power required to run new labor-saving devices such as refrigerators, washing machines, radios, phonographs, electric razors, irons, and vacuum cleaners. It all came in the 1920s. I once gave a talk at Central Michigan University in 1999, and the guy who brought me in at Central Michigan University was a guy named Walt Schneider, who was in his 60s, and this is 25 years ago now. And he told me he lived near Grand Rapids, Michigan, grew up near Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he grew up in the 1930s. The first time he saw indoor plumbing is when he went to college in the 1950s. That was the other America. The Ford Model A, there it is. On May 26, Henry Ford sent a secret telegram to dealers advising that Ford was starting early production, entirely new Ford car, superior design and performance to any now in the low-price light car field. He halted production of the Model T, began retooling his factories to produce an all-new automobile designed to effectively compete against all others in that segment. In late November came the announcement that on December 2nd, the still unnamed Ford automobile would be shown to the public at locations revealed to each and every Ford dealer. Pricing was announced on December 1st. The new Model A would be priced comparatively to the Model T. Following the revealing, deposits from eager customers poured in, and in the first 2 weeks, the automaker had reportedly accumulated 400,000 sales orders from dealers. 2 weeks, 400,000. It's over there. Remember the song Over There? Over There? Okay, it's over there. But there were problems in Europe. The First World War and its subsequent peace settlements gave rise to new ambitions, rivalries, and tensions. People had high expectations that the post-war peace settlement would create a new world order and ensure that the slaughter of the First World War was never repeated. And there are the four guys who are carving up the world. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson on the right, the tallest guy there. There was David Lloyd George of Britain and Vittorio Orlando of Italy, and Georges Clemenceau of France and Woodrow Wilson. The war ended on November 11, 1918, after 4 years of fighting and the loss of millions of lives. The Treaty of Versailles was signed June 1919, created the League of Nations, an international body intended to promote peace and prevent war. America never joined the League of Nations for various reasons, including cost and isolationism. But the treaty was an uneasy compromise for each of the victorious allies. Britain, America, France, Italy. Italy is already finding that Benito Mussolini is about ready to take over. And they looked, those four countries, to pursue their own interests. Germany was forced to surrender territory, disarm, and pay for war damages. The divisive conditions were criticized as overly vindictive by many in Britain and America. The treaty's terms caused an immediate outrage and lasting bitterness in Germany. And the rise of this guy, Adolf Hitler. The Treaty of Versailles left Germany in a surprisingly strong geostrategic position by creating Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states. The treaty put buffer zones between Germany and one of its traditional rivals, Russia. Fighting among the new states weakened them, and the geography of their new borders made it difficult to defend. So Germany emerged from World War I with small, relatively weak states on its eastern border. The Treaty of Lausanne officially ended World War I in 1923. Statesmen worked on the Treaty of Versailles until June 1919. The Treaty of Lausanne in Switzerland was signed by France, Britain, Italy, Japan, Greece, Romania, and the new Republic of Turkey. So why did Hitler hate Jews? Well, this is a typical anti-Semitic cartoon of the era. It's either a man or a woman. There's cleavage there, so it's probably a woman, although it looks like a man. And Jewish star on the hat and the stab. It's called the stab in the back. That's a German soldier. During the First World War, between 1914 and 1918, Hitler was a soldier in Germany. He was Austrian. At the end of the war, he and many other German soldiers like him couldn't get over the defeat of the German Empire. The German army command spread the myth that the army had not lost on the battlefield, but they had been betrayed. Well, who betrayed them? Who betrayed the Germans? It was called a stab in the back. Hitler bought into the myth, the big lie. Jews and communists betrayed them and brought a left-wing government to power that wanted to throw in the towel. The start of Nazism is in 1920, and there was Hitler in 1920 in Munich. It's February 24th, and he delivers the Nazi Party platform speech to a large crowd, and that is often regarded as the foundation of Nazism. The German Workers' Party had already existed. Hitler was a great orator. Can't take that away from him. He was an artist. And he laid out a 25-point platform. His central idea, strengthen German citizenship by excluding and controlling Jewish people and others deemed non-German, like him. He was an Austrian. He was not a German. And yet he is speaking like he is a German, even though he's an Austrian citizen. So, in a perfect world, Adolf Hitler would have been thrown out of Germany. He writes Mein Kampf while he's in jail, My Struggle. He predicted a general European war that would result in the extermination of the Jewish race in Germany. Mein Kampf was written in jail. He was arrested on November 9th, 10th for his participation in the beer hall push in Munich when the Nazi Party tried to overthrow the German government. He was released from jail in December 1924. And there's Hitler and his cohorts, 1922 Nazi Party members.
What did he do?
What did he do? He tried to overthrow the government. He was an artist. He was a painter.
Huh?
He was a
No,
painter.
but I mean, when you said he was in this thing, what was he in? What did he do?
Jail. He was in jail because he was trying to overthrow the government.
Well, what did he do to try to overthrow?
He and others tried to overthrow the government on November 9th and 10th in Munich. That's basically it. He blamed the Jews for the defeat of the war and created the stereotypical enemy. The defeated country, Germany, was in an economic crisis in the 20s. According to the Nazis, expelling the Jews was the solution to all problems in Germany. The Nazi Party itself experienced slow growth, numbering about 17,000 in early 1926. He was on parole, so he couldn't speak publicly in Bavaria, because if he did, he might be deported back to Austria. Well, meanwhile, back in the USSR, that's St. Petersburg, Russia, and that's Lenin over, looking over me. On November 12th, Joseph Stalin became the undisputed ruler of the Soviet Union as Leon Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party. In 1926, Stalin outmaneuvered his opponents to take control of the Communist Party. Trotsky was sent into eternal exile, ending up in Alma-Ata, Kakistan. Mount Rushmore, you've been to Mount Rushmore. Well, this was the original model, but I got a question for you. Were there supposed to be 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore, yes or no?
Yeah.
Yes or no?
Yes.
No.
No. The answer is no. On October 4th, 1927, sculpting begins on the face of Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills of the National Forest, South Dakota. South Dakota historian Don Robinson, who in 1923 was looking for a way to attract more tourists to his state, and he comes up with the idea. The Lakota Sioux people, who consider the Black Hills to be sacred ground, opposed the project. The mountain was previously part of the Great Sioux Reservation before being taken away from them by the U.S. government. One plan was to spotlight rugged regional heroes such as Lewis and Clark, Buffalo Bill Cody, and the Oglala Lakota leader Red Cloud at a different location. Another plan for Mount Rushmore was to have only 2 presidents, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, head-to-head waist statues carved into the mountain. The idea of adding Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt to the monument was an afterthought. Calvin Coolidge approved government funding of the project after a summer vacation in the Black Hills. The Great Mississippi Flood, 1927, and the lessons not learned. The flooding of the lower Mississippi Valley in April was one of the worst natural disasters in the history of the United States. After several months of heavy rain caused the Mississippi River to swell to unprecedented levels, the first levee broke on April 16th along the Illinois shore. Then on April 21st, the levee at Mounds Landing, Mississippi gave away. Over the next few weeks, essentially the entire levee system along the river collapsed. In some places, residential areas were submerged in 30 feet of water. At least 2 months passed before the floodwater completely subsided. That's what Arkansas City, Arkansas looked like on April 27th, underwater. The flood left an estimated 700,000 people without food and water, clothing, or work, and authorities were severely criticized for favoring the white population during the rescue and relief operations. Thousands of plantation workers, most of them African American, had been forced to work in deplorable conditions, shoring up levees near Greenville, Mississippi. As the waters rose, they were left stranded for days without food or drinking water, while white women and children were hauled to safety. African Americans gathered in relief camps, and they were forced to participate in relief efforts while receiving inferior provisions to clean up flooded areas. At least 1 black man was shot for refusing to work. Another picture of the Great Mississippi Flood. The Great Mississippi River flood disproportionately impacted African Americans. It was estimated of those who lost their homes, more than 500,000 were black. the Great Mississippi Flood, and this is where African Americans were put into a camp. The final report of the Colored Advisory Commission appointed to cooperate with the American Red Cross and the President's Committee on Relief Work in the Mississippi Valley flood disaster of 1927 noted, the camps in which we found the most satisfactory conditions were those where the local colored people had an opportunity to assist in the administration of affairs. The camps which were found to be especially good were Baton Rouge, Lafayette, Natchez. In the camps at Greenville, Sicily Island, and Opelousas, the colored people had practically no part in the activities of the colored refugees. At many of the camps, including the one in Greenville, Mississippi, National Guard troops prevented refugees from leaving and outsiders from visiting. Negro inmates complained whites came and went at will without passes, while colored people were not given similar privileges. There were also complaints of rough treatment of colored people and discrimination regarding the labor conditions and the distribution of food. Oh, the days when I was at CBS. CBS went totally downhill when they gave me that card that day. Absolutely went downhill. They were never the same after they hired me. Arthur L. Judson was a well-known manager of musical artists. After meeting with the RCA chief David Sarnoff, he thought he had a verbal agreement to provide music talent for the new National Broadcasting Company, but soon discovered that Sarnoff instead had set up his own NBC Artist Bureau. NBC was formed in 1926. Judson resolved to start his own network called the United Independent Broadcasters. He lined up a few investors, rented studio space at WOR 710 on your dial, AM in New York, and signed up 16 stations. The network would pay the stations for carrying its programs, plus talent costs and the hefty AT&T network line charges. All expenses would be paid by advertising. The Columbia Phonograph Company agreed to provide an infusion of cash, and it became the Columbia Phonograph Broadcasting System. Charlie Chaplin's voice was first heard on CBS. First time anybody heard his voice was on CBS. On January 27, Judson's United Independent Broadcasters paid the stations $500 a week, provided 10 hours of programming per week to the stations, mostly serious music and opera. But the expenses were huge, while advertisers were scarce, and so the new network was immediately in financial peril. After a few weeks, one of the partners, Columbia Phonograph, pulled out. Paychecks for the network's 12 employees stopped. That is WOR in New York in 1927. I was last there at 1440 Broadway about 40 years ago, and it didn't look like that, but they had a couple of the old things left. Judson offered to sell controlling interest in the network to Isaac and Leon Levy, owners of WCAU in Philadelphia. The Levys brought in additional investors, including Sam Paley, owner of the Congress Cigar Company. On September 18th, the Columbia Phonograph Broadcast System is officially launched on 16 stations nationally. Samuel Paley's intention was, hey, you know what, I don't care about this radio, but I can advertise my cigar business. The network struggled for a while under the new ownership. Rear Admiral W.H.G. Bullard, chairman of Federal Radio Board, and some new rules in 1927. Congress passed the Radio Act of 1927. Coolidge signs it into law on February 23rd, 1927. The act strengthened the federal government's authority to regulate all forms of interstate and foreign radio transmissions and communications within the United States, its territories and possessions. That would include Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Hawaii, Guam, Philippines, and adopted as standard that radio stations had to be in the public interest, convenience, or necessity. That's the Smithsonian Institute with my kids, and that is what a radio station would have looked like in 1927 doing a show. The act ordered stations to give equal time to political candidates 8, no obscene programming, no dirty words. The radio industry accepted First Amendment protection under the Constitution did not mean any speech was allowed on radio. Showboat. How many of you saw Showboat? How many of you know the signature song of Showboat? Old Man River. Old Man River. That's Showboat. Oscar Hammerstein II and Jerome Kern's musical adaptation of Edna Ferber's 1926 novel opened at the Ziegfeld Theater December 27. The musical examines the lives of Captain Andy and his troupe of traveling showboat performers, including his naive daughter Magnolia, her gambling husband Gaylord Ravenel, the tragic mixed-race actor Julie, and the black stevedore Joe, who marvels at the consistency of Old Man River as they travel on. This was one of the first on Broadway because the show featured black and white actors on stage together, and featured this guy, Paul Robeson. And Robeson is wanted by Kern and Hammerstein, and they expand what the book was for the role of Old Joe into something else. He sings Old Man River, and it was written specially by Kern and Hammerstein for Paul Robeson to perform. Laurel and Hardy. Any Laurel and Hardy fans here? Anyway, there they are. Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy first appeared together in a short film in 1926 when they signed separate contract with the Hal Roach Film Studio. They officially became a team shortly afterwards. They appeared in the silent short Putting Pants on Philip. Hardy was already working for Roach and others when Roach hired Laurel, whom he saw in vaudeville. Laurel and Hardy were then put together in the film, and they seemed to complement each other. Comedy teams were usually composed of a straight man and a funny man, but these two were both comedians, and they knew how to play the straight man when the script required of it. Now, you might remember their well-known catchphrase. Well, here's another nice mess you got me into. And I'm going to get you out of this nice mess here. We're going to talk about the legacy. Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh's legacy is at best mixed. That's a Heil Hitler salute. His legacy is very complicated. On one hand, he was a pioneering aviator who made a large impression in the aviation industry. A decade after his flight, he also was the lead spokesman for the America First Committee, which wanted America to stay out of European affairs. Lindbergh admired Nazi Germany and thought that America should ally with Hitler in 1941 instead of the Soviet Union. He embraced eugenics. He was a racist and an anti-Semite, although he said, I'm not. Al Jolson, the blackface character. Well, the jazz singer opened the doors for other talkies, began the process of silencing silent movies. Jolson appeared in blackface, which was very common in vaudeville at the time. Because of that, Jolson's legacy is staying. Yet, Jolson championed civil rights and pushed for blacks to be treated better in Hollywood. He's in a movie in the 1930s with Cab Calloway, and he demanded that Cab Calloway got equal treatment to what he got by the Warner Brothers studio. Clara Bow in 1933 said, I want to be known as a serious actress and not as the it girl. But by 1933, her stardom had faded because of the talkies. She's forever known in Hollywood as the it girl. Eleanor Glynn described it as warmth, charisma, vivacity, and apparently effortless charm. Movie studios still look for the it girl. Babe Ruth, 1935, retires as a member of the Boston Braves. On May 25th, the Babe hits 3 home runs as a member of the Boston Braves in a game against the Pittsburgh Pirates. He would play 5 more games, did nothing, retired on June 2nd, 1935, finished up with 714 home runs, a mark that lasted 39 years. Hank Aaron broke Babe's record with his 715th career home run on April 8, 1974. Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney became good friends. Tunney hung up his gloves after one more fight in 1928. Tunney became a banking executive. Dempsey operated the Times Square restaurant. In 1964, Dempsey campaigned for Tunney's son, Democrat John V. Tunney, when he successfully ran for the U.S. Senate from California. The Flappers. Whatever happened to the Flappers? Well, the lifestyle and look disappeared, and the roaring 20s era of glitz and glamour came to an end in America after the 1929 Wall Street crash. The Coolidge prosperity ended. Unable to afford the latest trends in lifestyle, the once vibrant flapper women returned to drop hemlines, and the flapper dress disappeared. In 1963, Betty Friedan released the book The Feminine Mystique, which referenced the flappers. It was the start of the 1960s women's movement, that book. There is a Model T. It was made until 1931. In 1932, Ford made the Model B, which had a fuel pump attached to the motor. It was only around for 5 years, but 4,849,340 Model A's were made and sold. That is Rostock, Germany, and the sign says no Nazis. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in 1932. Germany annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938. Germany invaded Poland. September 1st, 1939, that started World War II. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The war ended in 1945. The Nazi Party has been outlawed in Germany. Hammer and sickle, St. Petersburg. Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1924 until his death, March 5th, 1953. Soviet Union was an ally during World War II of America, but the relationship soured. After a few months following the war's end on September 2nd, 1945, a Cold War soon erupted, lasted until the 1980s. Leon Trotsky was assassinated in Mexico City, Mexico, August 21st, 1940. The finished product, Mount Rushmore. It opened on October 31st, 1941, became a tourist attraction, but the monument is controversial. Sioux activists have protested the U.S. confiscation of their ancestral lands. They want their lands back. The Black Hills are particularly important to them because it's a region central to many Sioux religious traditions. Sioux activists want the monument to be taken down. That is the mighty Mississippi behind me. The Mississippi flood plan had national political effects. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover directed the Red Cross efforts to provide massive flood relief. He won attention for his humanitarianism. He was successful in his 1928 presidential bid. The flood became a major factor in prompting the migration of African Americans from southern cities to the north and west. CBS, that's where The Price is Right was taped until this year. Beverly Boulevard in Los Angeles. William Paley became the president of Columbia on September 26, 1928, moved to New York City, quickly signed up 49 radio stations. Paley built CBS into one of the world's leading radio and TV networks, hiring entertainment stars. Paley also built up the news division, but he would also kill stories he didn't like and would censor and eventually fire the Smothers Brothers. Tommy Smothers just passed away from their TV program in 1969 for their anti-Vietnam stance. Showboat. Showboat was so popular that it ran for 572 Broadway performances. First revival, 1932. Paul Robeson regularly spoke out against racial injustice and was involved in world politics. He supported Pan-Africanism, sang for loyalist soldiers during the Spanish Civil War, took part in anti-Nazi demonstrations, performed for Allied forces during World War II, fueled by misrepresentation of a speech the actor made at a USSR-backed Paris Peace Conference in the late 1940s. He was labeled a communist and blacklisted in the 1950s. And finally, Stan and Ollie. They remained with the Hal Roach Studios until 1940. They appeared in 8 B-movie comedies for 20th Century Fox and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer from 41 to 45. After they finished their film commitments at the end of 1944, they concentrated on performing stage shows, embarked on a musical tour of England, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. They made their last film in 1950, a French-Italian co-production called Atoll K. They appeared in 107 films as a team, 32 short silent films, 40 short sound films, and 23 full-length feature films. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
1927 it affected your lives or impacted your lives, didn't it? And you would think something from 97 years ago would be long gone, but the cultural wars are still being fought. And other things from 1927 are still out there. But that was the first, one of the first years of modern America. Any questions, any comments?
When did you say you were born?
56. I was born in 56. My parents were born in 32 and 34. But I did have my grandfather's influence. He was born in 1892. And he